You finish a weekend doing things you actually wanted to do. Maybe you watched a few episodes of something you enjoy, spent time on a hobby, talked with people you like, and yet by the end of it, you feel oddly drained. Not sad, not bored, just tired in a way that doesn't quite make sense. You didn't do anything hard. So why does your mind feel like it did? This experience is more common than most people talk about. And the usual explanation that you just need more sleep or that you're becoming less resilient doesn't really hold up when you look at what's actually happening inside the brain during enjoyable activity. Most people assume mental fatigue is a direct result of effort. The harder the task, the more tired you should feel. But that model breaks down quickly once you start paying attention to your own experience. Plenty of difficult tasks leave people feeling energized, and plenty of easy, pleasant ones leave people feeling flat. The real picture is more interesting, and honestly a little uncomfortable once you see it clearly. Mental fatigue isn't just about how hard something is. Research suggests it's closely tied to how much sustained cognitive engagement an activity demands, regardless of whether that engagement feels like effort. When your brain is actively processing, making small decisions, following narratives, responding to social cues, or managing any kind of input, it is working. The fact that you're enjoying it doesn't change the underlying biology. There's a particular system in the brain associated with evaluating, deciding, and regulating attention. When that system runs for extended periods without genuine rest, certain chemical byproducts begin to accumulate. Research in cognitive neuroscience has pointed to a compound called glutamate as one possible mechanism here. When it builds up in specific brain regions, the brain actually begins to pull back from cognitive engagement as a kind of protective response. You don't feel this as pain. You feel it as a vague flatness, a reduced motivation to think, a kind of internal quieting. And critically, this process doesn't care whether what you were doing was enjoyable. Think about what actually happens when you watch a show you love. You're tracking character motivations, following plot threads, emotionally responding to outcomes, forming predictions, noticing small details. None of this feels like work. But cognitively, a significant amount of processing is happening continuously. Your brain is not resting. The same is true of social interaction, even the good kind. Talking with people you care about involves constant real-time interpretation of tone, meaning, expression, and response. You're monitoring how you're coming across, choosing words, adjusting based on reactions. Again, not effortful in the way a work presentation is effortful, but still genuinely demanding on the systems that manage social and emotional cognition. Scrolling through your phone, even mindlessly, involves constant micro-decisions and attention shifts. Each new piece of content requires a small evaluation. Is this worth my attention? Do I care about this? Should I engage? That cycle, repeated hundreds of times, adds up. It doesn't feel like decision-making because each individual decision is trivial, but the cumulative load is real. This is where the experience starts to feel a little strange when you think about it. You can spend a day doing things you genuinely chose, things that brought you actual pleasure, and end up with less cognitive capacity than when you started. Not because anything went wrong, just because the brain's resources are finite, and sustained engagement consumes them regardless of whether the engagement was pleasant. There's also something worth understanding about the role of novelty in complexity. More interesting content tends to be more cognitively demanding, not less. A show with a rich storyline requires more of your brain than a repetitive one. A conversation about something meaningful requires more processing than small talk. In a real sense, the more you enjoy something intellectually, the more likely it is to contribute to mental fatigue, not because enjoyment is draining in itself, but because the things we tend to find genuinely engaging are usually the things our brains are working hardest to process. This creates a quiet paradox that most people never quite name. The activities we reach for to recover from the demands of daily life are often not cognitively neutral. We treat them as rest. But rest, in the neurological sense, requires something closer to genuine disengagement. Walking without a destination. Sitting without a screen. Time where the brain is not actively managing input or producing output. That kind of rest is rarer than most people realize, and it tends to feel uncomfortable at first because we're not used to it. Now here's where it's important not to take this too far. This does not mean that enjoyable activities are bad for you, or that you should stop doing them, or that anything you find pleasurable is secretly working against you. That would be the wrong conclusion entirely. Enjoyment has its own distinct value. Social connection, engagement with stories, intellectual stimulation, creative activity. These things contribute meaningfully to quality of life and are supported by a great deal of research in psychology and well-being. What this is really about is a mismatch in expectations. Most people have absorbed the idea that if they like what they're doing, they should feel restored by it. And when they don't, they assume something is wrong with them. They're not grateful enough, or they're somehow not doing leisure correctly, or there's a deeper problem they need to fix. But the feeling isn't a failure of attitude. It's just a biological signal that sustained cognitive engagement has a cumulative cost, and that cost doesn't get waived because the engagement was chosen or enjoyed. Understanding that distinction changes how the experience feels, even if it doesn't change the experience itself. The tiredness after a day of things you liked is not a sign that you liked them less than you thought, or that you're broken, or that you need a fundamentally different life. It's a sign that your brain was active, that you were present and engaged and genuinely involved in what you were doing. There's something almost reassuring in that. Once you sit with it, the uncomfortable part isn't really the fatigue. It's realizing how rarely most of us actually rest in the way the brain needs. How often we move from one form of engagement to another without any real gap in between. Work ends and screens begin. Screens end and conversation begins. Conversation ends, and we reach for something else. The brain rarely gets a genuine pause in the cycle. Most people don't notice this until they're forced to stop. A power outage, an illness, a long and empty afternoon, and then the first few minutes of actual quiet feel strange, even anxious, because the brain has been in continuous engagement mode for so long that disengagement doesn't feel like rest. It feels like something missing. That feeling is itself worth paying attention to, not as a problem to solve, but as information about how the mind has been operating and what it might actually be looking for. Mental fatigue after enjoyable activity isn't a contradiction. It's a very direct reflection of how cognition works, and how little most of our modern leisure actually resembles rest in the way the brain experiences it. The things we enjoy most are often the things our minds are most alive to. And being alive to something, really present with it, has a cost. That's not a reason to disengage from life. It's just a more honest picture of what engagement actually involves.